Brome grass is an annual winter grass weed that has proliferated across southern Australia. There's two particular species that are of interest that are causing considerable problems for growers. Those being Bromus diandrus and Bromus rigidus. These species very difficult to decipher in their early vegetative stage, but once they get into their reproductive stage, it can be distinguished. Diandrus tends to have larger panicles which are looser and nodding and tend to lay over. Rigidus, as its name suggests, the panicles tend to be much more rigid and erect. Brome's highly competitive, so can compete fairly early in the context of their cropping program, and with that competition can come some fairly severe yield losses. You don't need very high densities before growers are starting to incur reasonable yield penalties and losses. We've seen a considerable change in its germination and dormancy behaviour. Many of our cropping populations now have this inherent or deeper dormancy which allows them to evade early control tactics. Brome seed will remain viable for up to 3 years without fresh seed input. Unfortunately, through our cropping practices, we've been selecting for much more dormant populations. Some other features that we've seen with Brome which has certainly allowed it to evade that control, and there's been certain cues for germination. Two have been this requirement for cold temperatures to initiate germination, but also this inhibition of light. A lot of focus needs to therefore go into how we can more effectively obtain good in-crop control and later seed set control.
In any one season, we really need to be using more than one weed control approach. So we need to be attacking it either we will be doing our herbicide, then we need to be looking at some other management tactics later in the season to deal with that seed. The key to resistance management is making sure that the survivors of any herbicide application do not set seed. That is the key. So that means coming in with these other tactics, things like crop topping, spray topping, you might have to do a brown manure crop, you might have to do a fallow, you have to use harvest seed management like narrow windrows and narrow windrow burning in autumn.
Windrow burning, essentially they need to be confident that they're collecting seed in the first ripe. For ryegrass, we know that 400 degrees centigrade for 10 seconds is sufficient. For Brome, while we don't have any exact figures, we'd surmise it'd be something similar, but for perhaps slightly longer duration to get a good kill. Choose
the crops that are well adapted to your area, choosing the right cultivars that are best suited to your area, and then your row spacing. The narrower a row, the more competitive a crop will be.
Using IMI sprays to an extent, not any more than I have to. Complete knockdown or brown manure is one practice that I've started doing that is trying it. Rotational crops, peas, lupins, canola. Trying to use using the IMI sprays and legumes in a rotation in a process over a couple of years.